How to failover Azure SQL Active Directory authentication. Azure SQL provides a robust authentication mechanism through Active Directory, allowing users to authenticate with their Azure AD credentials. However, in the event of an Active Directory failure, it is essential to have a failover plan in place to minimize downtime and ensure continuous access to Azure SQL databases. Step 1. Understanding Azure SQL Active Directory authentication. Azure SQL Active Directory authentication allows users to connect to Azure SQL databases using their Azure AD credentials. This authentication method provides a seamless and secure way to manage access to Azure SQL databases. Step 2. Configuring Azure SQL Active Directory authentication. To configure Azure SQL Active Directory authentication, you need to create an Azure AD user or group and grant them the necessary permissions to access the Azure SQL database. You also need to configure the Azure SQL Server to use Azure AD authentication. Step 3. Understanding failover in Azure SQL. Failover in Azure SQL refers to the process of automatically switching to a standby server in the event of a primary server failure. This ensures minimal downtime and continuous access to Azure SQL databases. Step 4. Configuring failover for Azure SQL Active Directory authentication. To configure failover for Azure SQL Active Directory authentication, you need to create a standby Azure SQL server and configure it to use the same Azure AD authentication settings as the primary server. You also need to configure the standby server to use the same Azure AD user or group as the primary server. Step 5. Testing failover for Azure SQL Active Directory authentication. To test failover for Azure SQL Active Directory authentication, you need to simulate a failure of the primary Azure SQL server and verify that the standby server takes over automatically. You should also verify that users can still access the Azure SQL database using their Azure AD credentials. Best practices for Azure SQL Active Directory authentication failover. Use a separate Azure AD user or group for the standby server to avoid any authentication conflicts. Regularly test failover to ensure that the standby server is working correctly and that users can access the Azure SQL database without any issues. Monitor Azure SQL Server and Azure AD authentication logs to quickly identify and resolve any issues that may arise during failover. By following these steps and best practices, you can ensure a smooth and seamless failover of Azure SQL Active Directory authentication, minimizing downtime and ensuring continuous access to Azure SQL databases. This helps maintain business continuity and reduces the risk of data loss or security breaches.